Welcome back, everybody, to your, well, not daily update on the Malads and Empire, because that's not what we're going to do today. Today we're going to talk Discworld. I was supposed to do this like a couple of days ago, but, life and stuff. So this is the talk about Wyrd Sisters, and I'll get into that in a second, just like a quick update. I know I said we'll start with Stonewielder this week, which we are not going to do, because there's a bunch of reasons. The main reason is I'll be leaving for a conference tomorrow, where I'll be talking about something very, very different from what I talk about here on the channel, that being fascism and anti-fascism in black metal. And we'll see how that goes. But I'll be on the road, and I don't know how much time I'll have to A, read, and B, record videos. We'll see. Maybe I'll actually manage to show some pictures of my travels on, I don't know, Instagram or whatever. So if you really want to see that, you can check that out. Link should be down below, I guess. I was, over the weekend, I didn't, I thought I might get a head start on reading and stuff, but instead I traveled to Berlin for a concert, had 5 hours, 6 hours of delays, and crazy train adventures. So, yeah. Here I am, still slightly knackered, because, that was like a 36-hour round trip, I guess, something like that. With no sleep. But since we had our discussion of Wyrd Sisters a week ago, and I didn't manage to record the video so far, that's what I'll do now. Just a quick update. Because of the aforementioned conference and stuff, we won't have our next talk after 2 weeks as we used to have, or like usually have. That's so not on Sunday, but in 2 weeks. And we've decided, because next ones are a bit shorter, we've decided to move to do book 7, which is the next one, Pyramids, and then do also book 9, which is Eric, which is a very, very short one. It only has, I don't know, 150 pages or something like that. So we'll try to talk about those two, and then we'll go back in order with Guards, which is book number 8, and the next, I guess, big entry point for those of you who have not yet started reading along with us. Guards is the first City Watch book, and thus, I guess, the next, probably last really new series that starts. I mean, there's later stuff that depending on how you think about the Susan stuff, if that is its own series, and the other, there's later on stuff going on, but the City Watch is probably the second most or most popular sub-series next to the Witches one, and so that might be a good point for you to catch up with us and start reading, and then join us in the discussion on the Discord, and join us on our Sunday evening conversations about books. You're all welcome there, and yeah. If you have any other questions or whatever, then just, I don't know, message me and I'll help you out. I'll put the link to the Discord down below. And, yeah, let's get started with Wyrd Sisters before I forget what I wanted to say, which will happen anyways. All right. Cheers. Alright, so Wyrd Sisters is book 6 in publication order in the Discworld series. And it is either the first or the second one in the, what you might call, Witches sub-series. Why do I say either the first or the second one? Well, it features Granny Weatherwax, whom we have met in book 3, Equal Rights. And there's one or two, like, not flashbacks, but like callbacks to that book. But it is the first one. We have the classic lineup of the 3 witches: Granny Weatherwax, Magrat Garlic, and Githa Og. Although there's possibly a earlier version of Nanny Og in Sorcery as well. Not Sorcery, in Equal Rights as well, under a different name. Might just be this, like, a precursor character. Anyway, It also features the Kingdom of Lancre for the first time, like in actual detail. It kind of was mentioned before in, equal rights and Mort for a second. But this time we have a lot of Lancre going on there as well, and thus you can say that it starts the classic Witches series, with the next books being Witches Abroad and Lords and Ladies. I think I don't miss any. No, I didn't miss any. And then, later on there's Masquerade and Carpe Jugulum, Jugulum, whatever. Yeah, Latin and stuff. So there's more to come, but this one is sort of where we have that classic, where a lot of that stuff gets established in a way in the Kingdom of Lancre. I hadn't read that one for a while, and I think what we came up with in the discussion and afterwards, and in my reflections, like, I know why I hadn't read it for a while. I've still read it like 3 or 4 times, but it's been years since I read it. And I've forgotten a lot because my brain's dumb, as am I, but and I forgot how good it actually is. So if you have not yet started Discworld, this is certainly another point where you can really get to grips with like all the strengths that Terry Pratchett as a writer has to offer. They're all on display here, more so than in any of the previous books. He really manages to step those things up and meld his different strengths, because when you look at it, oh yeah, and of course this is sort of like full spoiler, because I don't need to review this book. It's like, go read it, it's great. But I've said that before. But what I was going to say is that when we look at Discworld as a whole, we have all these, like the first 2 books, the Rincewind books, are very much about a maybe parody, or you could call it parody, it's not so much satire. It's parodying different aspects of the fantasy genre. We have the books like Equal Rights, which is looking at a socio-political or social issue, that being gender roles and how we deal with them. And we have Mort, that brings up more philosophical questions about like the meaning of life, the human condition, and things like that. Well, we have once again Sorcery, a Rincewind book, which kind of goes back to the parodying stuff part in a lot of ways. And Wyrd Sisters takes all of these different things and melds them together in a very, very homogeneous way. It has all of these aspects. We have a parody of a very specific type of media, that being mostly Shakespearean plays. Well, I guess you can call Shakespeare like a genre to itself at this point. It certainly takes most of its like parody aspects from Hamlet and Macbeth. But it also adds in other stuff there and talks about the idea of theater, the idea of actors, and so forth in there as well. But that's sort of like the media that is parodied in an interesting way. It, once again, obviously has social questions of gender roles and roles of, expectations in that area that are discussed. Also the idea of like the role of the witch, or the reputation of witches, or what witchcraft is, questions of that nature, questions of rulership, things like that. On a social level, it also asks like very interesting philosophical questions about the human condition, about what it means to be human, what it means, what we do when we create art, and what that says about us as a person, how like art reflects reality or the other way round. It takes all these things and just all of that's in there, and it's great because it is handled in that very typical Pratchett way. He also steps up once again his level of like making really good one-line jokes, making really cool, pop culture reference jokes, but also just like his prose has reached that level that you can expect for the foreseeable future. Like the opening, when like one thing he does here, that's something that I'm That's really extremely well done and great. So one of the main characters of this story, in a way, is a thunderstorm. Like, it's a viewpoint character, sort of, the thunderstorm hanging around, becoming bigger and bigger, and doing all this. It's very interestingly handled to look at a thunderstorm as an actor or performer or an artist, in a way, training, trying to gain reputation, practicing. It's really funny, and it uses, once again, like, Pratchett has this way of, like, what I would call, like, typical Pratchett prose, which is very interesting imagery to bring across something that, obviously, I know I haven't read it, I haven't watched it yet, but I know the Critical Dragon has made a video on, like, language immersion and stuff like that, and Pratchett just doesn't care about that. Pratchett's prose and language and use of words is never even trying to be all contained within the setting. he just, like, breaks that set level of immersion all the time, but by doing it the way he does, he makes it very, very. He reaches a level of description that is incredibly graphic, I would say, and incredibly powerful. In fact, it starts with Thunder stabbed at the ground like an inefficient assassin. That image is extremely good. You can exactly imagine what he kind of means there, but it would totally not fly in, your serious fantasy. Your Brandon Sandersons or what have you would never use that kind of phrase, because it breaks that level of immersion in a lot of ways. There's obviously more of that kind going on there, but it's what I mean when I say that he's, like, Pratchett is more comfortable with what he does. He's not even pretending to write a fantasy novel, like just a fantasy novel. He writes a book that is obviously in the fantastic, it is in the comedic, but it's very much its own thing at this point. And he just goes out and does all these unique or very unique things, almost unique things there in a more confident way, and that really shows. Now, obviously, making fun of Shakespeare is easy. It should be done. But it also, what Pratchett also shows here is how much these things that he pokes fun at with, like Macbeth and Shakespeare and Hamlet and all these other Shakespeareana, how much these parts of media, Shakespeare, has become part of the canon and of our way of looking at the world, in a way. Like, I mean, that's sort of what you get with Pratchett, and the way he parodies things is, like, he makes you question your us question our, like, assumptions of how things work by actually stating them explicitly, and then you realize that's dumb, or at least it should it should actually, work in a different way, or we should at least question things. So that's something that I think he does really well, with the idea that, of course, the king becomes a ghost because he's murdered, and then he hangs around and has a very boring life as a ghost. And you have these questions of destiny, and whether destiny makes us or we make our destiny. And Terry Pratchett comes down very heavily on the side that destiny, while being an imperative, and he later on comes up with that idea of narrative causality. He hasn't used the word yet, but I think he'll do it at the latest in Guardsguard. But the point is, the idea that, of course, if you are the prince, you are the heir to the throne, and one of the destiny will assert itself. Like, yes, that is a possibility, but if you don't want, you can always overrule destiny and make destiny your own. In a way, I feel that's one of the main messages. It's obviously something that we've seen before in Terry Pratchett's writing, especially in something like Equal Rights, and to a lesser extent in Sorcery as well, with Conina, and obviously in in Equal Rights with Escarina Smith. The idea that people can make their own destiny. You are who you want. You can be who you want to be, and do that, even though maybe, the world, all these unwritten rules of how we think the universe works, does that against is completely against you. That will happen, and that's like one of the main philosophical thrusts of Terry Pratchett's writing in general. It's just expressed very clearly here because with the Shakespearean material that he uses behind it, he can make these ideas of destiny, prophecy, and all of that stuff very clear, and then just go and twist them around. Now let's look at the characters, shall we? And this is an interesting bit here because we have like we have three witches, Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Ogg, and Margaret Garlick. And they are obviously a play on the idea of like the typical like the mother, maiden, crone kind of idea that we have there in folk beliefs and so forth, but obviously Pratchett kind of twists them around and does his Pratchett thing, and it will pop up later again in later books, the mother, maiden, crone idea, and the question who is whom in that whole story. But we still do have, and this is the other part, like compared to earlier books, these I feel are the first like really well-rounded characters. Don't get me wrong, I do really like Rincewind as a character, and I do really like Rincewind's stories. I'm a huge Rincewind fan. I know he's not everyone's favorite, but I do really appreciate the humor there. But Rincewind is not exactly a well-rounded, three-dimensional character. He's not supposed to be. But with the witches, we come to the point that Pratchett actually has these like recurring characters that are well-rounded, that have obviously traits that are exaggerated in a way to prove points or make points, but he does something more with them and gives them all these different dimensions. Margaret Garlick is one of the best cases there. Now, she is the youngest witch. She tries to prove herself towards her elders, get approval, but also has like new ideas defines herself in all these different ways, and is so much more than just a little naive and whatnot. It also gives him the chance to poke fun at folk beliefs or modern ideas of witchcraft, Wicca, and these kinds of religions, the idea of femininity that comes with that. And obviously, I'm not going to go too deeply into that hole right now. Ideally, and I'd love to talk about it at some point, but ideally I'll ask someone to come on who has like practical experience with that, because I obviously neither a practicing witch nor a woman, so that would make I'd want to have someone there with more practical experiences in that field to talk about it maybe at some point. But we have all these like ideas that we have about modern occultism, modern esoteric or witchcraft or witchy things. You have the crystals, the occult jewelry, all of these things that make witchcraft more of a lifestyle, or it can be, or try to sell it as more of a lifestyle than anything else. We have that in there, but also the idea that the underlying idea of witchcraft is something else. You may use those trappings if you want, because they make you feel better or whatever, but the actual kernel of where witchcraft comes from in Pratchett's world is a different thing. So that's just like an interesting side discussion that shows up there, because you have, as I said, you have all these dimensions with Margaret, who, kind of understands that you don't need them, but she wants to, and it's just like more like dimensions there, especially once we have the not really relationship, or maybe soon relationship, with the fool who becomes the king. Also in there. And this is something that we'll get back to in a second when we talk about relationships. Then we have obviously Nanny Ogg, who is probably my favorite witch because she's so much fun to read. Like Pratchett manages to subvert tropes there while still describing something that is sort of recognizable, I guess. with Nanny Ogg as someone who has lived or lives life to the absolute fullest, but in like when it comes down to it, she still is a pretty good witch and does her witchcraft stuff, like all the things that are required from witches as a social function. This is obviously really important with the way Pratchett talks about witchcraft here. That there is a specific role within a specific society for witches, and that is a social role. It's obviously, there's the medical part, helping people out with those kind of things, but there's also a like helping how to, helping with not really judgments, but helping out with social issues and other questions, and sort of and that part is something, the social aspect of witchcraft is something that Nanny Ogg is extremely good at. And Pratchett Max does that by, subverting the idea of that you have to be a respectable and whatnot kind of person, adhere to really stupid ideas of chastity, sobriety, or whatnot, to be, a responsible and respectable person, because Nanny Ogg does none of that. She's just, she's just a very good person, and people respect that, or at least fear her and her reprisals in other ways. But that's also part of the fact that, that even Nanny Ogg, who seems to be sort of the Joker in that group of those three witches, is a very serious character underneath, and Pratchett already builds that up. And it'll show from time to time in later novels as well. And then, of course, you have Granny Weatherwax, the most powerful of the witches, the oldest, well, maybe oldest, you don't know. Certainly the one who works the hardest at presenting a very specific role, a very specific image. And one of those parts is that she can't ever admit that she doesn't know anything, so she asserts stuff that, that's something we saw already in Equal Rights, that she just claims to know things that she doesn't, because being right is an important aspect of her, like, being. But through those things we also know, she is not stupid, she just doesn't know some things because it's not part of her, education and whatnot. But it's the way it is described makes all of these three witches very interesting, well-rounded characters. Where it kind of falls a bit flat is when it comes to the dimension of like the character depth with the new Duke and the Duchess. Although even there Pratchett does interesting things. And we're going to talk about all of these things kind of now. So, sort of the philosophical questions there is like, you have the Duke who murders, like obviously stand-ins for Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but he twists those things in different ways. And you have the Duke, who through his madness becomes more and more evil, but also more and more sane because of that pressure, that outside pressure. Which, the way Pratchett handles that is just very interesting. Because he does something, he knows that it's wrong, he kind of does it because he feels he has to take, to come to power and whatnot, and then he feels guilt, and that guilt, he just pushes that guilt away after a while and becomes a more and more sane person, doing, like, even more, like, not evil things, but coming to that, like, very clear-cut, like, sane way, a rational way of dealing with problems through becoming more and more insane, which is just an interesting way to show that, because it would be so much easier to have someone just go completely insane, like he does at the end. We obviously have the whole idea with the washing away the blood from the hand, which he takes straight from Macbeth, but here it's the Duke who does it, and from like it escalates more and more over time. And we can see like when he starts using, just not washing, but using sandpaper and even worse things to just wash away the imagined blood from his hand, which is, an cool. It's done well. And then we have the Duke's wife, who at some point just says like, yeah, well, I'm evil, and I do it again. Is that like a perfect character? No, but it is something that we also see a lot with Pratchett. Pratchett, like when we look at what the Duchess, I don't even think she has a name in the whole novel, um, but with her like phrase like that, the strong rule the weak and so forth, she kind of spouts what you might call fascist catchphrases, but she is evil and through, because that's what we see at the end when Granny Weatherwax forces her to face her true self. She's like, you know what? Yeah, I'd do that again because I'm so deeply in there. And that's an interesting philosophical point, because it means that some people are just beyond redemption and consciously evil and not just misguided. So yeah, that's something that you see in that book as well that I personally think is interesting in something that is, at least on the surface, mostly a comic book. I like it's funny, it's comedic. There's a lot of humor in there, but there are very serious questions, very serious topics underneath. Um, Now let's go back quickly to the witchcraft thing, because when we have with the Duke and the Duchess is when the Duke reads books on witchcraft, and we come to the whole like thing that Pratchett does with Lonker, and will come up again and again, is the idea of how folklore and folklore studies, especially folklore studies in the first half of the 20th century, I guess, and like the 19th century, are very, very unreliable and have a lot of what people claim there is more like imagination and romanticism. There's a lot of romanticism going on there. Um, there's reasons for that. In general, it kind of is the same thing that you have with all these like fairy tales and mythologies that are written down at the time. The idea that studying folklore can help to define some sort of national identity in a way. There's obviously a lot of problems with that, but we don't want to go into it right now. The point is that we have these ideas of like how witchcraft is bound up with a very interesting, weird image of female sexuality, how most of that is perpetuated by men who have no experience in it whatsoever, and how that then perpetuates some sort of myth about witches and witchcraft that you like can see in like real world history as well, when you claim witches are this and this and this, but for the people on the ground that's totally not the case. So Pratchett kind of makes his points there against this idea, or like this way of doing folklore studies or talking about witchcraft, and those are valid points to consider in like looking at our world once again. Another point that I personally really appreciated is now these small bits. Pratchett becomes more and more adept at, breaking the it's all fun and jokes kind of thing, doing throwaway lines or one or two sentences to really, really drive home a characterization of a scene or a person or a relationship that is just incredibly deep. We have one of those situations where you have the witch is trying to get the couple of actors to adopt the boy, the prince, who's supposed to be the heir to the throne, but needs to be hidden and so forth. And Pratchett manages to like give us all of the emotional depth, the emotional baggage in that situation in like one or two really well written asides. It's like apparently the couple had a daughter that died or something like that. There's a conversation, just a sentence that kind of hints at that, and then they decide to adopt the son. And you see the way Pratchett goes about it is like that. the ability of reading faces also means that you need to know when to turn away and not read them, and that I feel is a beautiful way to make to show us how that couple is knows each other well and has that conversation, or not even a conversation because it's kind of non-verbal, and you have all that stuff there, but Pratchett just drops that in this small aside without going into any form of detail whatsoever. And that's just brilliant. That's just done really, really well. So, what else when I'm praising this already so much? Well, there's ridiculously fun moments in there. There's wonderful prose in there. When he goes and describes the landscape, it's a landscape of describable beauty, which I personally really love that bit. There's new additions to the world and stuff like that. We hear the first time about the dwarf songs and dwarf bars that are all about songs all about gold and stuff like that. A lot of fan favorites show up that I obviously love. The Librarian has a short cameo that I really appreciated. With an interesting discussion on racism as well. When there's the guy insulting racists with the one dwarf with racist slurs, and the side that people tend to be racist against, but not against trolls, because trolls are 7 feet tall and can go through walls. So people tend to not insult those kind of people, which comes down to the whole idea that usually racism is about punching down and looking for victims that will not fight back. One of the essential parts of racism, that, or at least of verbalized racism, I guess. You have these smaller sides in there that I, once again, really appreciate. You have a whole discussion about propaganda, how changing history, changing reality through words, through media. It's not ever fully laid out in theory, but the way he does it is just incredibly cool, because he manages to make the discussion and still make it funny and still make it not preachy. Which is something that I personally really like about Pratchett in general, that he, for the most part, he never becomes preachy, even though a lot of the stuff he does is obviously about politics and social issues. We have, as I said, the discussion of art, and the question of why, if we have all the freedom to create art and talk about whatever we want to talk, why do we as a species tend to focus on the dark side of humanity in our media? Why are we always looking in and not out? Why do we do that? Now, there's obviously questions to be asked all the way outside of Discworld. The idea of why does so much of art focus on the darker side of the human condition and not on the more positive sides, is something that we could talk about in a separate video at some point. Yeah, and then we have just a ridiculous way of talking about the idea of suspension of disbelief when watching a theater, the idea of how that works or doesn't work, which is just hilarious if you read it. That way of the witches commenting on the theater is just glorious. There is all the, more whimsical parts. I feel like whimsy is more something that you see in Lancre than you see in other parts of the Discworld, which sort of is this mix of English countryside and Scottish countryside, I would say, in a lot of ways. What else was there to really praise? Because I can't praise this book enough. It's just incredibly good. If you want to start with Discworld somewhere that is not publication order, I feel this one or possibly Guards are the two best ways to start with Discworld, because they are funny, but they are still serious enough to give you food for thought. And if you don't want to go too deeply into the absurdist humor, which there still is, Um, the idea of having the countryside itself be a character, be alive, and having wanting us to care about it is obviously something that you could read in an Arthurian way. You could also read it in a more like environmentalist way, I guess. Um, the absolute absurdity of royalist conservatism in a lot of ways is just glorious, with Naniog always praising the old king for being a very gracious king, even when he burned down places or did all kinds of other terrible things that kings traditionally do. But it's like, yeah, but he did it in a gracious way, and that makes it kind of okay. Well, it doesn't, but shows like the absurdity of apologetics for like an institution like royalty, like monarchy in a way, and that's pretty neat, pretty neatly done. Um, Obviously, I really, really like the joke about the droit de seigneur. No one knows what droit de seigneur is, and so they all think it might just be a really big dog because he has to exercise it all the time. That bit I found really hilarious. I mean, there's other like really cool jokes in there, really glorious lines. This my favorite one is the rite of passage one, which is just like, yeah, go read that. And if it doesn't make you laugh, you're probably a bad human being in your soul. But um, so what else can I say to wrap this whole thing up? I would say Wyrd Sisters is sort of where Pratchett finally comes into his own, like reaches like the level that we see later on, at least all the way through books up to at least Nightwatch, maybe a bit later than that, before we come to like the late phase of Terry Pratchett novels. But this is sort of where we have that mix that Pratchett has of his very unique voice, his very unique prose, and the mix of humor that is more about parody and satire. The humor, the deeper philosophical, sociological, social and whatnot issues that are presented there, and actually cool plots and really interesting characters. He mixes all of that like in a brilliant way. Obviously, some of those books I like better than others, but we have reached that point where he finally does all of these things he has done before in earlier novels, but all of those at once now on a great level. And yeah, certainly one of the better to best Discworld novels, and I'm glad I finally reread it after like 4 or 5 years, I guess. Anyway, I feel that's sort of it for today. Thanks for watching. Go read more Discworld. Join us on the Readalong. We'll talk about pyramids next time, which is in 2 weeks. You have time to read Discworld, like both pyramids and Eric. And yeah, talk to you then. Cheers.